Hello, everyone, and welcome to the third and final keynote panel, which is the EMEA keynote panel. And today we're going to be talking about the topics of measuring and DevSecOps maturity. So joining me on this panel today, we have Alyssa Miller from S&P Global. We have Tash Norris from Moonpig, and we also have Patrick Debois from Snyk. So I'll ask each individually actually to introduce yourselves, tell us a little bit about yourselves and your respective organizations. So why don't we start with Alyssa?
Sure. So, hey, everybody. I am Alyssa Miller, former developer, longtime security professional. As Simon mentioned, I'm currently the Business Information Security Officer for S&P Global Ratings. So some of you may remember back to the days of Standard & Poor's, same company, same deal. So just really excited to be here.
Awesome. Welcome, Alyssa. And over to Tash.
Hi, everyone. My name's Tash. I'm a recovering solutions architect and security person. Still occasionally draw diagrams if you let me loose anywhere with a whiteboard or a pen. I just can't help myself. And I am currently head of cybersecurity for Moonpig.
Awesome. Welcome, Tash. And finally, but by no means least, Patrick.
Yes, I'm Patrick. I would say I'm a DevOps enthusiast, and by extension, I am a DevSecOps enthusiast. About 10 years ago, I, by accident started the first DevOps days, and I've been following DevOps ever since. I've done many roles from developer, manager, system tester, CI, you kind of name it, and I've run it over the years. That's why I have the gray hairs. Kind of figuring out how we can collaborate better together. And currently I'm at Snyk figuring out how security comes into the fold. So
awesome. And people call you the father of Java, not father of Java, sorry, the father of DevOps, right?
Well, that too, but
Did you this is a pre-recorded session, but did you get a Father's Day card from DevOps yesterday, Patrick?
No, so it isn't the father. They say it's the Godfather, but
the Godfather.
Okay. But it's not like in the mafia film movies. it's just like I'm being nice to them all the time.
Nice.
So that's why they call me like that.
Excellent. Well, what a great panel we have today. This is a great set of humans and people on the panel. So excellent to have you all together. And let's kick off this session. And why don't we take it back to scratch and talk about companies that are just beginning their journey into DevSecOps. And Patrick, I'll start with you. In terms of the activities that an organization starts with when they want to go ahead and take the first steps into DevSecOps, what do you see they typically do to enter this brave new world?
Yeah, so usually the first step is to kind of assess the pain, right? They kind of need to do an inventory. They need to know, what security vulnerabilities they're facing, what issues they're having. So that's usually the first step, is creating from the awareness, like what's out there, what are we like, what do we need to fix? And that can go in both directions. Either they come already from a DevOps journey, so they got the pipeline under their belt, and they're now extending this to DevSecOps, and they're putting like a lot of the security tooling into their pipeline, or they're completely new, and at that time they're kind of like starting both and the collaboration between the teams and the technology journey. But it usually all starts with an inventory, like how big is the pain in our current company. So that means checking vulnerabilities in open source, in their licenses, in their current processes. And that's, usually where they start their journey.
So it's very much like a visibility starting point, right? Not necessarily let's try and fix all these things, but let's try and almost like take stock of what we have. Yes,
and if they don't feel the pain, they're probably not going to start it. So you might like tell them do DevSecOps, but if the pain is not big enough or they're not aware of this, they might not start it. But usually when they start, they have an idea of something happened in production or anything like during that. Pain is usually a good like starter. And then the first thing is, like in any incident, you assess what's out there. You try to assess the situation before you can actually fix that.
Yeah, I guess I'm just following on from Patrick there. One of the things that I've noticed as well is just checking that teams have a common understanding of what DevSecOps actually means, and then agreeing what your milestones are and making sure you're all on the same page. I think a lot of people see DevSecOps as a destination rather than a journey, and so they will come into their mindset of we've not done anything until we've got full automation everywhere from patch management through to change management, rather than maybe agreeing, hey, here are some key milestones we want to hit, and then measuring our maturity throughout that process.
Yeah, and I think like joining those pain points will take you onto that journey, right? Your direction on that journey will be based off that pain, as opposed to someone hearing DevSecOps maybe at a conference or something and say, oh, we need that in our org for no reason, but we need that. Is that similar to what you've seen, Alyssa?
Yeah, I mean, what's interesting is you look at how organizations get started into DevSecOps. A lot of times it gets driven by the security team, because they're like, hey, you guys are doing this DevOps thing and we need to be involved. And we're kind of sitting out here on the outside because we're not the best at like knowing how to be involved in that pipeline. And so then it goes to it like flips to the complete opposite, where we had all of these like really time consuming, practices and things we wanted to do in traditional security. Now we want to bring security to DevSecOps. And it's like, we become like hyper focused on tools. It's all about automation. We're going to automate the world. We're going to automate everything in security. And so the danger is that people tend to get frustrated when they realize they can't automate things. And then it's like, well, how do we do this? And so that's where I think, you see that early on in organizations as they're starting down that journey, they start thinking they're going to automate everything. And then as they mature more and more, they start to realize, yeah, maybe we need to think about people and process and how those things fit into play here, and how we actually make this a part of the culture rather than just, oh, we're going to just take all the security things and, tie them into a pipeline.
And do you agree with the activities that that Patrick mentioned, Alyssa, with more of the trying to identify what the pain points are, then turning that into almost like a visibility kind of play in terms of understanding and itemizing, everything that you're touching and using?
I think the best ones do, yeah. I mean, most of the time, and you would hope that that's even just part of selling such an initiative, is that, hey, we need to look at where we are today and justify it. I think sometimes, Patrick mentioned that post-incident world where you've had some type of security incident and now it's like, oh, we weren't doing the security things, we got to do them. There is a little bit of a rush to just like start slamming in SCA tools and SaaS tools and DAS tools, and let's get all the different security scanners and let's buy up all the things and plug it in. But I think the less it's driven by incident and the more it's driven by proactive desire to improve security, the better you see people kind of take stock first of where we at now, how do we roadmap where we want to go, and then let's then figure out how we build those security practices into the pipeline.
And so this is an interesting part. So on that roadmap, then go on that journey. Once we plan that out, how do we know that the activities that are going to take us on that journey and progress us through that journey, how do we know they're actually going to be beneficial to us? And what do we need to measure in order to be able to show, hey, you know what? Since doing this, we've improved by this much. How do we do that? And surprise, surprise, my first measurement question is going to you, Alyssa, in terms of you're the measuring queen in DevSecOps.
Wow! Please don't take that one. Oh God, no. But seriously, I mean, that's kind of the holy grail, right? And early on in organizations, a lot of times they're focused on very tactical things or the things that are easy to measure. If I've got tools running identifying vulnerabilities, well, I can look at the number of vulnerabilities and I can say, hey, my vulnerabilities went up or my vulnerabilities went down. And I mean, to a point that's valid, right? Because total number of vulnerabilities, if they're in prod, that tells you what your risk posture is. But the reality is we don't want to be catching vulnerabilities in prod, and we're hopefully catching them sooner. And so the number of vulnerabilities becomes less of a critical measure than really, okay, what are we fixing? What's hitting prod? Can we look at things and start to really understand relationships between metrics? So as we start to see organizations get, again, more mature in this, or they start to move down that line, they move away from just measuring raw numbers of vulnerabilities. And now it's like, well, let's look at, vulnerabilities per release, or, where in the pipeline those vulnerabilities are being discovered, or how many critical vulnerabilities that caused us to break a build that we discover here or there, and how do we reduce that number? You can start to tie this back to even the backlog. Then where are we? How many backlog items are getting created out of our security initiatives, and how does all of that start to relate? Because if you see your vulnerabilities go up and you see a 20% increase in vulnerabilities, well, that may indicate a problem, but that could also be because, if we look at our pipeline, our deploys went up by 30%. In which case, now a 20% increase in vulnerabilities is actually kind of better. So you have to, as you get in this, you really need to start to understand the broader the picture of what's occurring within the environment. You can't just focus on security measurements and metrics in a vacuum. They have to tie into what are we doing in measuring our overall pipeline, our deploys, the time to deploy, number of works in progress, all the things that we're used to doing in that DevOps space.
Yeah, it's a tough one, isn't it? Because you're trying to almost like measure the side effects almost that happen in the background when you make these changes. It's a tough one to almost like associate as well. Has this change actually produced those side effects, or would those side effects have happened because of the natural flow of my development, or this feature wasn't going to cause that many vulnerabilities, etc.? It's a tricky one to associate. How about? Sorry, go ahead, Patrick. I think you're going to add something.
No, I think there's a tendency to kind of simplify the measurement in a way that indeed we look at one or two metrics and then we focus on those. But there's a funny thing with metrics. If you focus too much on specifics, you can get them better, but they might not have the effect you want it. So you really have to keep your eye on the ball. And it's not only about reducing the number of vulnerabilities, because if I hold all coding and I hold all deploys, I'm happy too, and I can get that metric perfect. But if there's nuances that we need to look at, and that's why the metrics should be used for interpretation and not per se as the final goal. That give us input and information to make our own decisions, but just making your decision on one metric is just a problem for a lot if you start doing that.
Yeah,
sorry.
No, go ahead, Tash.
I was just going to say your risk otherwise is you can drive the wrong behaviors, right? If you champion the wrong metrics, the wrong behaviors take flight. And I think one of the things that I've seen is kind of following on from something Alyssa said is you want to focus more on where you're finding things. So your time to detect becomes really powerful rather than the number of vulnerabilities. That being said, you don't want teams to not report things because they don't want that to impact their metrics. But at the same time, for us as security teams, it might be a metric that we track internally. For me, if I see that we've got no vulnerabilities, that doesn't mean we're doing an amazing job. It probably means that something's not reporting correctly. And equally, if I see lots of vulnerabilities in some areas, I think Alyssa touched on this, and not others, it probably means that I need to look at, is someone missing a stage in our pipeline that they shouldn't be? And is there a problem with code coverage or project coverage? So I think I've certainly learned over my career so far that there's some metrics that I keep just for the security function to help us measure our impact and our coverage versus a metric that I might report further out, things like time to detect, time to fix versus number of vulnerabilities.
Interesting. I like that approach, because then people aren't gaming that in terms of, we know this is what we need to do to get that number down, and that's what we're being tracked against. So interesting. I like that. But Patrick, one thing I'd love to ask you actually is less around the pure numbers point of view, from numbers of vulnerabilities, those kind of things, but more around the team or organization level. How can you assess whether whether it's levels of I guess just how good a team is running in terms of DevSecOps with a team, a department, an organization? How do you measure that?
Yeah, again, you probably look at many different metrics, and it's already been mentioned. We could scan your code as an individual group and say, we did really well on vulnerabilities, what we found. So we see some improvement, like you're not doing cross-site scripting anymore. So you're kind of improving on, usually that is the security knowledge. So the team is progressing on like the errors and the mistakes or the issues they're getting. And then there's the other one is like, imagine it occurs. Like, how do they react to something? Will they just put it on the backlog? They don't kind of focus on it. They don't ask questions. So that's kind of like how, they really kind of care about this. And then the third one I would measure on is how well they actually engage with the security team itself. So, they might be able to fix some stuff in the pipeline themselves, reduce the number. Then they kind of, react to issues in production and when things happen, that's a good like posture they have. But then the third one is actually like, how well do they interact with the security focus? Do they report issues? Do they ask questions? Do they kind of like talk to them when decisions are being made? So that's kind of the tree where I would look on for them to be engaged as a team, and how well they're doing DevSecOps as a team.
Mm-hmm. And much more contextual than just a set of numbers that are only as accurate as the thought that went into them, which is kind of dangerous as well. Just being providing a number, right? But,
there's this saying. Imagine you're at a party and you would measure the number of interactions you have during a party, right? It doesn't tell you how good the party was. So you can't really assess this by the number of touch points or the number of things you fixed, because you kind of need to have another kind of more higher abstraction and see how well this fits into your company. But obviously, if you don't have the first thing, if you're not talking to the people, right, there's a step to be taken. And I want to say this caveat, like, we often, as we're deep in the field, and we often already think about the exceptions. Yes, but what if they don't do this? So there's nothing wrong in getting the metrics up, as we've said before, but it's like the more you mature, the more you understand the nuances of this. And the same thing is happening in, when a team adopts Scrum, right? They're all about story points in the beginning. And after a while you say like, story points, well, that was just to get our bootstrapped in our thinking, how we kind of deal with these situations. And afterwards, the story points get like, way less important in the discussion. So, you need to have this bootstrap mentality, and then you can kind of progress on the, the more mature path. But, the due point on a team is don't assess them only on the technical point. Also look how they are in the process, and then how they are on the collaboration side as well. So.
How hard is that to scale? Because obviously everyone's going to have different opinions on those kind of things.
Well, it's interesting. If you would treat all the teams the same, it's probably gonna result in some average measurement. But most of the points were is almost like a satisfaction score for people depending on the team, or receiving information from the team. And that is, I would weigh that in way more than I would like look at the technical kind of numbers, but one gives the other interpretation as such.
By the way, I can't believe I've been measuring parties wrong all this time. It's a harsh way to find out. Alyssa?
Yeah, so I was going to kind of build on what Patrick was saying. That culture thing is so crucial, right? I mean, it's DevOps, it's DevSecOps. It's all about culture. And so bringing people together and, breaking down silos, so to speak, or whatever, although I'm not really a fan of that particular term. But, I think part of doing that is having kind of that visibility for the teams of what does that look like. So when we think bootstrapping early on and, just trying to get our feet wet in this and understanding, okay, here's kind of what we're targeting in that first kind of phase, if you will, or whatever, whether you want to call it a maturity level or, certification criteria or whatever. And then what does it look like to get to that next level? So this is how we operate today. Here's the things we need to change about what we're doing to get to that next level. And then from there, what do we do to get to that next level? And having kind of those targets essentially that the teams can work toward. And that way, not only do you have something to measure against, but you've really put that out there for the teams that they can start to see, maybe there's something as they're working in their everyday, they say, wow, this is something we could add. It's actually in our silver criteria that, to get to this silver level, we got to be doing this. So I'm going to pull that in and we're going to start doing that now. And so giving the teams that kind of just what does good look like helps build that collaboration, that culture, because now they see that, this thing that maybe felt frivolous was actually something that we value as an organization. It's going to be beneficial to our maturity in DevSecOps.
Yeah, I wanted to say that is one of the hard parts when you start, because there's a million things you could do, like what first? And that is almost like paralyzing. And my advice is that if it's so hard to choose what first, just pick one, right? And start doing that and kind of see if you can make a dent or an improvement for that. And then reevaluate your kind of what is important. And that's going to be way better than making big plans up front to see, we're going to measure this over a long period. And I also want to touch on something else. Like, yes, the tooling is kind of, sometimes say it's all about the culture, but you kind of need the tooling and the culture, because the culture, the tooling often helps you, like inventory. You don't want to do this by hand, or it creates this safety from a pipeline. When you're doing the changes, you don't have to check this all the time. So both kind of go hand in hand. Usually they level up on the technology, they level up on the process, and it's kind of this gradual kind of level up. But, don't make a mistake and say like, well, we don't need the tools, but also don't make the mistake, we only need the tools. So it's kind of like somewhere in between there. So
Patrick's touching on a pet peeve of mine, which is when people measure their maturity just in capability or just in tools, rather than doing everything together and thinking about what are your capabilities, but what does your tool set look like, and what does your culture look like as well?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you need that one big picture. Tash, how do you find when presenting that, like, how do you find people want to hear that information? Obviously, presenting up to different groups that kind of want to obviously keep it simple, want to understand where their risk is. Do you find that you've had different mileage in terms of what individuals want as data versus what you want to provide them to give them that well-rounded view of security?
Yeah, absolutely. I think we all enter meetings like that with an idea of the story we want to tell, and then as the audience, the story you want to hear. And certainly, as you think about your execs or even just your C team, right? There's a story they want to hear, and it's not always in line. When I've thought about how I've measured and talked about our maturity in the past with different organizations, I've always thought about, what do I want to get out of this meeting, and what do I want to leave with? What's the thing that I want to take away? And so sometimes I have talked about my maturity to set expectations of, hey, we're a brand new function, we're not going to be here in a week's time or a year's time, and actually kind of setting that story up for how we're going to flow through something. Other times I've used it to talk about budget and how certain amounts of budget will ultimately release certain maturity levels, right? It's to a degree there's a pay to play model there from a maturity perspective. And then most importantly, I've talked about my prioritization. So why I'm focusing on certain areas, and especially for our execs, I've been able to play back here are our top risk levels, and actually here are how they relate to my maturity in those. And so this is how I'm going to drive down risk in those areas. So this is where I am today. This is my desired state. And this is ultimately the impact on risk. And sometimes that also comes with, please, can I have some more money?
Yeah.
Not always, but sometimes. Sometimes it's actually more about resource and about people championing your cause. That culture piece certainly plays a lot into it. But I think there's no, from what I've learned anyway, and I'm sure people might have different answers for this, there isn't a one win for how you want to present your maturity model. I think you really have to go in with, what story do I want to tell, but still be really cognizant of what do they need to hear from me to make whatever decision they need to make next as well.
Mm-hmm. And presumably, I mean, in terms of what risks there are of sharing that maturity state of either teams or the whole organization, presumably there are benefits, like you're able to back up the fact that you need maybe more budget, or you need, this is the state, this is where we need to focus on. It's like actual data that backs that up. Are there any risks that that can also come with that when you provide that maturity data, that maturity information?
For me, for sure. Like one might be, hey, I've not progressed in the way that I thought I would. I've not hit my objectives in certain areas. Again, for me, that comes down to actually throughout this year, we've learned we've had to pivot. We've, maybe our threat landscape has changed, or our customer base has changed, or our priorities as a company has changed. And so my focus on leveling up from a maturity perspective is actually being in these areas rather than these. I have used it previously to say, hey, this is where we were and this is where we are now. And hey, look at my growth. How wonderful is that? But absolutely the downside is this is where I am and this is where I want to be. And actually, maybe I haven't grown as much as I should have in some areas. But I think it becomes a trust-based exercise too, right? What's your level of trust and comfort with your stakeholders? And you have to have that to be able to give an effective story, right? That helps them to contextualize the decisions they want to make.
Yeah, helps them kind of like understand the work that is happening in the org and things like that. Patrick, I'd love to switch to kind of like from a maturity model point of view, or tracking maturity. How do companies that are obviously a little bit more advanced and able to be able to say, look, this is the plan we already know we want to go through, how do companies keep track of that going forward?
Yeah, I've seen many companies adapt one or more of the public models. Usually it's a maturity level 1 to 5, and they pick an area and they kind of say, well, we're doing the practices from this area, and they're typically in a level 1 or level 2. That gives you the visibility to where you think you are, but it doesn't address what should be the next thing to work on. So that is usually, much as we discussed earlier, the metrics give you a view to discuss, to create that share view. The same thing is happening with the maturity model, is they kind of have this overview of all the areas they should be improving. Then usually they kind of reach a common decision on where to go next, or which area to improve after considerations by the local team, by the company kind of goals, and kind of try to align both of them to kind of see if they're heading to the right direction. And sometimes it's also fine to say, well, you don't need to continue in that area because it's good enough for us. So that is also like a balance to do that. But creating that overview is usually done by adopting an existing framework, making a few kind of prioritizations that fit your current organization, and then to have that like regular discussion, like a review once a month, kind of on the plans or when things are going. I think the good ones are not just using this as an overview that says like, oh, when you only are 1, you should go to 2, but they are having that discussion, what to do first and what not to do first, together with the team, because then you understand what the local issues are. And then they try to help and suggest that team rather than force the team to have to take something on. I'm not saying there's sometimes is a need to force things when things are at risk, but the good ones then take this model, they show it, they discuss it, and then they work on the motivation of the teams to do it, less than imperatively saying, this is what you should do next. So it's kind of, how they deal with the situations. And then slowly, by providing the information on why you think it's a good idea, they should improve a certain area due to numerous reasons, you kind of like hope you transfer that to the team taking action on this.
That kind of sounds like it's easier said than done. Like when you have like so many teams that need that involvement, whether it's execs trying to pressure on something, whether it's the security team saying, so Simon, we totally need this.
You have kids, right?
I do, yes.
Try to tell them what to do versus try to motivate them to do something.
Well,
right?
but this is it. Okay, now that's interesting. So it's one thing motivating them to do it. If I was to ask my kids, what do you want to do? I know what they'd want to do, and I know it's not good for them necessarily, right? So it's not necessarily always just ask the development team and see what they want to do, right? It's that coaching or that discussion, input from the business, input from the security team, input from the development team. How is it common to straight away come out with one plan that everyone's happy with, or is it very much just a case of you do that bit because that's what you want to do, then the next bit is what we want to do, which is this? How does that pull together?
Oh, you want me to answer?
Yeah, no, please.
Sure. Well, yeah, it is give and take, right? But that is, if a team would start working on something, you gotta give them somehow a reason, and that kind of perspective can go in many directions. The motivation could be appealing to their professionalism. Sometimes that works, and they need to see this as part of their job. For others, it is, can we close this ticket as fast as possible? But there are all motivations that help people to do some security work. But maybe they need some building block for another team to build on. So that is not different than selling anything, right? You need to give something in return before you start asking them to do something. And that, how that works, it's probably going to be team dependent, like what makes them tick and how they fit in the organization to make them, do their job there. So,
okay. We've gone quite deep now into what an advanced company kind of does, and we started out talking about what a company does who is new to DevSecOps. Alyssa, in terms of how what the differences are between trying to address the how we measure question with these advanced groups versus a group that's just coming in, is there one model that we use, or is it vastly different?
It definitely varies from organization to organization. So in that way, and I think what you see is in young organizations, it's kind of standard fare, right? Again, they all kind of like, we're going to measure, number of vulnerabilities. We're going to measure these very simple tactical things because they're just the easy numbers to collect. Where you start to really see it diverge is as those organizations mature, because now they start to see, okay, what is of value to us? If I'm going to go before my, executive committee, or I'm going to go to the board and I'm going to present on security, one of the dangers in doing that ever when you put together that presentation is going in there and saying, here's all the bad things that are going on, right? Because, speaking to the motivation that Patrick was talking about, nothing is more demotivating and nothing is more sure to tune your executives out of what it is you're trying to get them to do than to give them all the doom and gloom without, any kind of, horizon or, hey, here's what we're seeing that we can build upon, and that's how you kind of build that motivation. So as organizations mature, they start to look for, instead of just, okay, let's measure risk, let's look at what security is doing in terms of our overall product goals, right? And this is where I sit down with executives, and it's, hey, you need to be building a value model here for security. How is security making your pipeline faster? So we've heard these terms like, paving the road and things like that. Well, how has the secure path become the one that is the easiest path for our devs to follow? And as a result, security is driving, more deploys per day or whatever. And I know I say that, and the developers out there are immediately like, what are you talking about? Security never makes us faster. Security always slows us down. It doesn't have to be that way. And I've definitely worked with different organizations where I've seen how, bringing, say, threat modeling into the user story level and having that information available through the pipeline actually speeds up the pipeline. And so that becomes the other piece then. Again, I kind of alluded to this before. It becomes less about measuring security in that just here's security. It becomes, how is security fitting into the pipeline? How is security actually enabling, say, again, more deploys per day or whatever's meaningful to you from the product perspective, from the business perspective, measuring security in context of those elements. That's the sign of a organization that's really maturing in this journey.
Yeah. Cool. And can you believe we're already 35 minutes in? So I want to ask one final question, which is to end with in and around maturity, which is an important one because we've talked about, how we can track maturity, how we can, assess maturity, I guess, with some of the larger organizations and things like that. But when we think about how we actually carry out that assessment, Tash, for example, a self-assessment, maybe from developers, or a assessment that we would want the security team to do for all groups. How do we actually go about rolling out that kind of assessment to an organization?
Well, hey, self-reflection is always a great thing. So we're always going to start with this, that a period of self-reflection to really feel like you can be honest with yourself around where you stand is great, but it is subjective, right? We're always going to see the best in ourselves, or we're going to see one point of a story. I think context is king here. It depends what you're measuring your maturity for. Is it to really understand for personal growth of your security program and your engineering function? Or is this for a thing? Is it for an auditor? Is it for your board? Is it for measurement? I think that helps. And so I would always suggest starting with that self-assessment, having those conversations with your engineering team, but let it be security team led, so you can bring a little bit of objectivity. And then depending on what story you want to tell, or how this is being used, use a third party. I think having someone who sits, whether that's outside your company altogether, or even someone from a product perspective, I think it's really important that Alyssa mentioned product. That's what we're all here for, right? That's why we have jobs. It's to build a product to release features to our customer base. And so having someone who can be product focused, who can help navigate the conversation to get back to your goal, that maturity goal, start to carry out those interviews with you. How are you on patch management, on change management, those types of things, can bring a level of objectivity to it. But I wouldn't rule out having a third party. There's plenty of companies out there that will use many established frameworks to measure you. But I'd always start on that self-assessment, even if it's just for that period of reflection, to really be honest with yourself. Often I found, Patrick spoke about motivation rather than asking people what do they want to do. I found personally that asking people to really reflect on where they think they are in that 1 to 5 model, and making sure they're clear, I'm not expecting them or wanting them to be at a 5, can drive a level of motivation that you wouldn't get if you went straight to third-party assessment.
Yeah, I think also that transparency is really key about why you're doing it, so that if you don't want it to necessarily turn into something defensive from the development teams. You want it to kind of like be very much, we want to do this to improve, so we can understand how we can develop faster, or how we can, so that it's of value to them, and then they can kind of be more honest. I love that approach. Do you think, Tash, that what works, you mentioned third-party assessors almost. Do you feel that there's almost like this cookie-cutter approach that what works in one organization can, you can just move to another team, move to another company and say, hey, I'm going to use this exact same maturity assessment and it should just work? Or do you feel like there's some customization that needs to happen for your orgs?
I've definitely seen the cookie-cutter approach. I think a lot of auditing companies certainly do that without the context of what your threat landscape is, what your risk level is, what data you hold, or what value you look after from a security perspective. But there are companies out there who will contextualize, who will look at your risk landscape and make sure your controls are appropriate. I think it's important to recognize that a good sign of maturity is a company that looks at appropriate controls for their threat landscape, not necessarily the full-fledged of everything they can do. Irresponsible spending for me is a lack of maturity, right? Just throwing money at a problem or focusing on tools is a lack of maturity. And so a good third party will look at that contextualization of what you're trying to protect, what's your risk landscape, not necessarily what your budget is, because sometimes that unfortunately doesn't line up, and using that to really build that maturity model for both where you are right now, where you should be, and then also helping you to understand where the industry is. Now, I think the industry tends to be a little bit below where we should be trending, but it's important that, if you are a small business focused on a SaaS service, that you're not comparing yourself to financial services, but that equally you're holding a high bar for you and your company and your customers.
Awesome. Well, we're eating into the break a tiny little bit, but I do want to just eat a tiny bit more into that break time at DevSecCon. I just want to ask one very, very quick question of each of you. The same question. What is your one golden tip on measuring DevSecOps maturity. And I'll ask Tash first, then Alyssa, and I'll be horrible to Patrick, who goes third and might need to reuse an answer. But Tash, what is your one golden tip for measuring DevSecOps security?
I will go back to something I said earlier, which is what story do you want to tell and what behaviors do you want to encourage? Your metrics should underpin those behaviors that you want to encourage.
Great advice. Love it. And Alyssa?
Don't let security off the hook. Remember that the idea of shared responsibility doesn't just mean everybody's responsible for security. It means security is responsible for making sure that software gets out quickly and with stability. Your SREs are responsible for security and making sure that things deploy quickly. Remember, that's what shared responsibility is actually all about.
Awesome. And finally, Patrick.
Yeah, so I would say, think about when security department doesn't exist anymore, would people still be doing the right thing?
Oh my goodness. When does the security team go away, Patrick? Well, no more comments. Let's just end on that bombshell. So thank you very much to Tash, Alyssa, and Patrick. Sorry to leave you on such terrible news there, but we wish what a wonderful discussion that was. Thank you all for a great discussion, and have a wonderful rest of DevSecCon 24.